Alright, welcome back. We will start Chapter 1 of the course, the human body and orientation. In this chapter, we'll go over some basic anatomical terms that you need to go over, the various body systems that we have, and the various levels of organization that we have in the body. First off, we'll start with the actual terms, the definitions for anatomy and physiology. They are related, obviously, but they're not interchangeable. They're not the same thing, even though people use it that way. Anatomy is the structure of body parts and how they're organized. And physiology is how those body parts function. So even though they're related, they're not the same. So anatomy, the actual structures themselves, and for physiology, how those body parts function. All right, body parts can be described in multiple levels, varying from very, very complex down to the very, very simple. And all materials in the body are organized in the following order. And it's in red and in bold because you need to know the proper order. Now, which one is more complex, which one's more simple. The most simple, atoms. And after atoms, we have cells. After cells, we have tissues, and then organs, then organ systems, and then finally the organism. And we'll talk about all these individually here next. But you do need to know this proper order. Alright, we'll start with the most simple, then move up to the more complex. The first one, atoms. These are the building blocks of all matter. And atoms are what combine to form molecules. And we'll talk about those in our next chapter when we talk about basic chemistry. After that, we have cells. This is the smallest unit of all living things. These will vary greatly in size and in shape and in function. And we'll talk about cells in Chapter 3, I believe. Once you have a group of cells working with the same function, those are called tissues. So a large group of cells working together with the same function, that's now a tissue. When you get two or more types of tissue working together, that's when you have an organ. The brain is an organ. The stomach is an organ. The heart is an organ that has two or more tissue types working together. When you have groups of organs working together, that forms an organ system. Now, respiratory system, digestive system. Those have multiple organs working together with a common goal. And lastly, the most complex, the organism, the highest level of organization. That includes the actual living person, or the living organism. Alright, here's a nice little flowchart that goes from the very simple, the atom. Atoms, here you have molecules. This is actually the compound water here. Macromolecule, then organelles, those are part of cells. Cells together form tissues. Tissues together form organs. Several organs together form an organ system. And several organ systems working together form an actual organism, the most complex level of organization. Alright, next we'll go into a brief intro into all the body systems that we have. We will go over most of these throughout the course, but not all. There are a few that we just don't have time for. The first one, the integumentary system. This includes the skin and all the hair and the nails. And the integument is another word for the outermost covering of the body, which is the skin. Some functions are to protect the internal organs from damage and also to help regulate body temperature. This is why you sweat when you get hot or why you shiver when you get cold. Alright, next, the skeletal system. This includes all the bones and all the cartilage and all the joints that your body has. This is what helps give your body a framework to allow movement and also support. Now, your muscles have to have something they attach to so you're able to move. And it's also where various blood cells are made. That's something that we'll talk about in a future chapter. So all white blood cells, all red blood cells, all platelets are all actually made within bones. Alright, next we have the muscular system. As you can imagine, responsible for all body movement, including moving fluids throughout the body, including blood. The nervous system. This will include the brain and all the various types of nerves. And this acts as the body's main control system. This will interpret information from the outside world and interpret it so your brain can understand it. Now, whatever you see, whatever you hear, whatever you touch, whatever you taste, all of that is sensory information that has to be interpreted by your brain. and it's done by the nervous system. Next, we have the endocrine system. This is what will include all the hormones that help to regulate multiple functions in your body, including metabolism, growth, reproduction, and many, many more. We'll talk about those a little bit later on in the course. Next, we have the cardiovascular system. Now, cardio is always a reference to heart, and vascular is a reference to vessels, blood vessels. This includes all the blood vessels and the heart, not just the heart by itself. And of course, its main goal is to transport materials both to and then out of cells. So delivering oxygen, then picking up waste and taking it out of the cell. Next, we have the lymphatic system. This works very closely with the cardiovascular system. It includes structures like the spleen, tonsils, and lymph nodes. And its main function is to help with the immune system of the body and also to cleanse and filter the blood. Next, we have the respiratory system. This includes the lungs and the trachea and the primary bronchi that we have. And of course, its main goal or main function is to make sure that the cells are supplied with oxygen. Next, we have the digestive system. It's responsible for breaking down food that you eat and turning it into a usable form of energy that your cells can use. So taking that pizza you had at lunch, turning it into something usable for your cells. Next, we have the urinary system. This helps to remove waste from the body in urine, including the structures included in this system include the bladder, the urethra, and the kidneys. And lastly, we have the reproductive system, responsible for producing sex cells like eggs in females and sperm in the males. So we have ovaries, testes, and eventually will produce offspring. And these are all in red and in bold, so you need to be able to match the organ system to their main function and how they're listed here. Alright, anything that is considered to be living has some necessary functions that it must maintain in order to be considered living. And we'll go over some of those here next. The first one, maintaining boundaries. You have to be able to keep what's inside your body inside and what's outside of your body from getting inside. So, such as your skin and various functions of the skin. So you don't want anything that shouldn't be in your body in your body. So that is necessary to be considered living. Next one is movement. Of course, all actions are performed by the muscular system. You must be able to move to be considered alive. Next one, responsiveness. You can also describe this as being able to respond to stimuli. Whenever you touch something really hot, you need to be able to know that it's too hot and respond to that by taking your hand away. Or you know that you're hungry, so you know to go out and get something to eat. Being able to respond to your environment. Next one, digestion. Being able to not only eat food, but break down that food into a usable form that your cells can have use of. Next one, metabolism. This is a generic term that refers to all the chemical reactions in the body. This is including creating compounds and then breaking compounds down, like you do in digestion. Next one, excretion. Also a generic term. It covers the removal of waste from the body. You must be able to urinate, you must be able to defecate. If you can't do that, your organs will start to shut down because those are very toxic to your body. If organs start to shut down, then you will eventually die. So this is incredibly important. Next one, reproduction. As a species, humans must be able to reproduce and create more humans, otherwise we will become extinct. And lastly, growth. An increase in size due to an increase in number cells. We all start off as one single cell, the fertilized egg. They go from that one cell to a newborn baby is trillions of cells later. So be able to grow from that to an adult, all that is considered growth, an increase in the cell number. So all those are considered necessary life functions. Alright, next we'll go over some basic terminology that we use in anatomy. And with so many scientists all over the world speaking countless numbers of languages, you have to have a an agreed upon starting point where terms like inferior, superior, medial, lateral, all those terms that you hear on TV or read in books will have the same meaning. And that agreed upon starting point is called the anatomical position. And here's that position described, and I'll show you a picture of that next. You have the person standing up, facing forward, the arms are at their side, and their palms are facing forward also. It's this point, this anatomical position, is where all those terms that you hear in anatomy will be based from. So that's where everyone will start from. Okay. And here's a picture of it both facing you and then facing someone's profile. So, standing up, facing forward, arms by their side, and palms facing forward also. And I'll use this picture to go over something that's very, very common, a common mistake that people make when they first start off in anatomy. This happens all the time. You will probably do it at least once or twice. And that is confusing right and left. If you look at this structure here, where the cursor is, when you look at it, that is on the right-hand side of the image. But it's not about you as the observer. It's about her as the patient. So this is her left hand. This is her right hand. So everything on this side is left. Everything on this side is right. So don't be confused when you see an image like this on a test, because it will come up on a test. And I say, well, what is this? If you put left hand, it's going to be incorrect. So yes, it's the left-hand side of the image, but it's not about you, the observer. It's about the patient. And it seems, kind of nitpicky, but if you think about it, if you have to go to the doctor and have your left kidney removed, you better be sure they know which side to take out. Left kidney would be over here as opposed to over here. So it's very common to confuse left and right with these positions. And we'll go over some of these terms here in a few minutes also. Okay. Now there'd be really no way to go over every single term in anatomy when it comes to direction and position. There's just way, way too many. But the ones we will go over are going to be very, very common, ones that you'll see all the time. And they are grouped together with their opposite. So for example, superior and inferior. Superior means above a different body part. So think of at your job, your superior is above you in the chain of command. And the opposite of that would be inferior. That means below a body part. So someone who works for you is your inferior. They are below you. Also keep in mind that these terms are relative to each other. So take, for example, your chin. Your chin is below or inferior to your nose, but it is above or superior to your belly button. So depending on what you're comparing it to, a structure could be both this and this. Okay. The next two, anterior and posterior. Anterior means toward the front. Also is known as ventral. It's perfectly fine to use ventral or anterior. Those are interchangeable terms. Opposite of that would be posterior. This means toward the back. Another word for posterior is dorsal. Again, perfectly fine to say dorsal as opposed to posterior. They are interchangeable. So going back to this image here, the anterior toward the person's front, also known as ventral, and posterior toward the back, also known as dorsal. Superior going above, inferior going below. Okay. Next two, medial and lateral. This is a reference to the middle of the body. Medial is towards the middle of the body. So think of medial and middle. And the opposite of that would be going away from the middle of the body, which is called lateral. For all of you who are football fans, a lateral, pitching the football to the side. So you're going away from the midline. So going back to this image here, think of this dotted line as the middle, dividing the body in half. Going toward it, going toward the middle, be medial. Going away from it, lateral. Next two, superficial and deep. Superficial, closer to the surface. So a superficial cut wouldn't be that big a deal because it's close to the surface. And the opposite of that would be deep, which is much more internal. So a deep cut, superficial, not that big an issue. A deep cut, it would be an issue because you're getting more internal. And these two terms I have on here last because these two are probably the most difficult for people to understand at first, distal and proximal. And these are references to where body parts are in relation to the trunk, which is the chest. So distal is being further away from attachment to the trunk. So think of distal as being distant, being further away. And the opposite of that would be proximal. Think of this as being in proximity or being closer to the trunk. And here's what I mean by those. Okay, we'll compare the hand and her foot. Her hand here is closer to her chest than her foot is. So her hand would be described as being in proximity or being proximal compared to her foot, which would be further away or being distal. It's all in relation to the person's or the patient's trunk. So how close you are to this. Hand would be closer than her foot to her chest. Okay, in addition to the terms that we just discussed and many others that we just don't have time to go over, the body can be divided into imaginary planes. And there are several, but we'll go over the main three, and they're listed here. The first one, the sagittal plane. This will divide the body into equal left and right halves, so being cut down the middle of the body. The next one, the transverse plane, is also known as the horizontal plane. This will divide the body into equal top and bottom parts. So think of this as where your belt is. You have the body part above the belt and body part below the belt. That'd be cut by the transverse plane. And the last one, the frontal plane, also known as the coronal plane, will divide the body into a front part, an anterior part, and a dorsal or posterior part. And here are all three of those with the image. This is where the middle of the body here, cutting this person into equal left and right halves. The sagittal plane, also known as the median plane. Transverse or horizontal, about where belt would be, top and bottom. And then coronal or frontal plane, dividing the body here. So this part would fall forward, and then the part back here would fall backwards. So you need to be able to recognize what plane is being shown in a picture, because it will most likely come up on the test. Alright, next we'll go into various body cavities that we have. And there are two major cavities that the body has, and each of those has further subdivisions, smaller cavities within that. So the two main cavities are the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. So remember what dorsal and ventral mean. The dorsal cavity has two smaller subdivisions, and the ventral cavity has three smaller subdivisions. Alright, we'll start with dorsal first. Remember, dorsal means toward the back. So this has two subdivisions. The cranial cavity, which will house the brain. And the other one is the vertebral or vertebral cavity. This is where you'll find your backbone or the vertebrae. So both of these are within the dorsal cavity. Alright, next we'll talk about the ventral cavity. Remember, ventral means anterior or toward the front. And here you'll have three subdivisions. The first one, the thoracic cavity. You have the heart and the lungs. The next one, the abdominal cavity. This will have the stomach, liver, spleen, kidneys, intestines. This is quite a large cavity. A lot of things are in this cavity. We'll talk more about this here in a second. And just below that is the pelvic cavity. This is where you'll find the internal reproductive organs and also the urinary bladder. So here are all five of those on one image. I'll talk about the dorsal ones first. Cranial cavity, where the brain would be. And attached to that, the spinal cord or the vertebrae, vertebral cavity. So these are the dorsal. And the ones that are anterior, the ventral. The thoracic cavity, the heart and lungs. And below that you have the diaphragm here. And then you have the abdominal cavity. And the stomach, intestines, gallbladder, liver, spleen, so on. And just below that, the pelvic cavity. And you'll see sometimes these two are grouped together, and it's called the abdominopelvic cavity. I think it's more appropriate to break it down into two separate ones because they are different. So thoracic, abdominal, pelvic, cranial, and vertebral. Alright, because the abdomen is so large in size and so important because it houses so many organs, there are ways to subdivide the abdomen. And these are just about the abdomen that we'll talk about here next. It can be divided into quadrants and also in various regions. So you have 4 quadrants, because quad means 4, and then 9 regions. Alright, the quadrants are the right upper quadrant, or you can abbreviate that by saying RUQ. Right lower quadrant, RLQ. Left upper quadrant, LUQ. And of course, left lower quadrant, LLQ. Now, most people define identifying upper and lower, but where people get confused on is knowing right and left. Again, this is the person's left side over here, and this is their right side. So, right upper quadrant, where you find, say, the liver, for example. Right lower, the appendix. Left upper, stomach. And left lower, a good bit of the intestines, including the sigmoid part of the colon. So expect to see an image like this on a test. So you have to know that this is left and this is right. Alright, in addition to those 4 quadrants, we have 9 abdominal regions. And remember, the quadrants and these regions are only in reference to the abdomen only, nowhere else. Alright, we'll go over the terms first, then we'll go over the image, where all these are listed, or all these are labeled. And if you want to think of the image first, think of your abdomen divided into a tic-tac-toe pattern. Okay? The upper middle square of that tic-tac-toe pattern is called the epigastric. Epi means above, and gastric means stomach, so just above the stomach. On either the right and left side of that area, you have the right and left hypochondriac regions. Okay? The middle square of our tic-tac-toe pattern would be the umbilical area, where your belly button is. To the right and left of that would be the right and left lumbar region. And then the lower middle square of our pattern would be the hypogastric. This is the lower middle portion. Hypo means below, and gastric means stomach, so just below the stomach. And on either side of that would be the right and left iliac region. So when, not if, but when you see this image on a test, now take note that all of these on here are left. All these over here are right. So epigastric here, top middle, right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac. Right in the middle, the umbilical region, where your belly button would be. Right lumbar, left lumbar. Just below that, hypogastric, right iliac, left iliac. So it's very easy to get right and left confused. And so let's say this image comes up on a test, and you label this area here as the right iliac region. It's going to be marked wrong because that's not the correct region. These terms mean very specific things. Right versus left, lumbar versus iliac. So if you don't have the full name correct, you won't get full credit. Alright, there are some other cavities that the body has that are a little bit smaller, but we'll go over them just briefly. The oral cavity, of course, includes the mouth and the tongue. The digestive cavity will begin with the mouth and will continue all the way throughout the digestive system. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later in the course. The nasal cavity, this is including and just behind the nose, where your sinuses and nostrils are. The orbital cavities will house the eyes. Orbit is a reference to eyes. And the middle ear cavities, these have the smallest bones that you have in your skeleton. These will help you transmit sound into being able to interpret that sound and be able to understand what you're hearing. Alright, that will conclude our first chapter of the course. I know we covered a lot of information, but we'll cover a lot of information in every chapter that we do. So it's important that you keep up with our material on a daily basis. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.